All right, welcome. This is the second in my lecture series on J. Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism, and the title for this lecture is Doctrine and Deception. And it's from chapter 2 of his book, Christianity and Liberalism, which he called Doctrine. And just to refresh, the goals of this class are to examine Machen's critique of modernism and liberal Christianity, and also to understand our own situation as a historic church affiliated with a liberal Protestant denomination. So I'll give the lecture and then turn the recording off so we can have a discussion. Just to recap lecture one was called The Conflict-Averse Church. Machen wrote Christianity and Liberalism in 1923, quote, not to decide the religious issue of the present day, but merely to present it as sharply and as clearly as possible. Presenting an issue sharply, he continued, is indeed by no means a popular business at the present time. He described this as the problem of people who prefer to fight their intellectual battles under conditions of low visibility. The conflict the church was avoiding in Machen's day was the colonization of the Christian mind by an invasive species of thought, which Machen called modernism or liberalism. And Machen defined modernism as the denial of any entrance of the creative power of God in connection with the origin of Christianity. So basically, it stripped out the supernatural elements of the origin story of Christianity, which meant also stripping out the supernatural parts of the Bible and the story of Jesus. Machen saw that modern liberal Christianity was content to use traditional Christian forms and language, but for non-redemptive purposes. And you'll remember that we talked at length about that last week, about how the church could seem very traditional. You wouldn't have noticed much had changed in the way it looked or the way people spoke or even the way the worship was conducted, but the theology had undergone a radical overhaul. So chapter 2 is called Doctrine. Machen begins chapter 2 noting that the modern liberal church is engaged in a subterfuge. And remember, we're talking about the modern liberal church of over 100 years ago now, which sometimes surprises me in reading this book about how current it sounds. The universities and seminaries of Machen's day were thoroughly soaked in modern liberal thought. And I think it's important to pause here that these aren't the categories that we use right now. When we say liberal, we tend to mean sort of, we're talking about politics, or conservative, we're talking about politics roughly analogous to liberal meaning Democrat or conservative meaning Republican. I don't even think those categories work for us today, but you can't apply them 100 years ago. Modernism was a specific school of thought, like it is in architecture or art. Liberalism also meant something as well, which we talked about last week. So anyway, the universities and seminaries of Machen's day were thoroughly soaked in this modern liberal thought. And that's what they taught their seminarians. They taught them modernism and liberalism. And those men graduated seminary in the 20s and 30s. They went on to pastor America's mainline Protestant churches throughout the following decades, the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s. At the seminaries and among the students, Machen wrote, quote, the reassuring employment of traditional phrases is often abandoned, and the advocates of a new religion are not at pains, as they are in the church at large, to maintain an appearance of conformity with the past. All right, so what does that mean? It means in the universities, in the schools, in the seminaries, they're not hiding. They're not hiding the fact that they are teaching something other than Christianity, that they're teaching a new theology, a new religion. But then when they go out to the churches, they're all advised, but don't say the quiet part out loud, right? So the superficial reason given for this lying to the church at large was, as you might have gathered from the first lecture, to avoid conflict, right? We don't want to kill the revolution in the cradle, right? We want to get in, insinuate ourselves into these institutions, and then eventually, over time, kind of through attrition, we will inherit what they are. We don't need to go in and announce who we are or what we're doing. Machen writes, few desires on the part of religious teachers have been more harmfully exaggerated than the desire to avoid giving offense. So the modernist or the liberal professor or pastor or seminarian would keep his opinions to himself, his modern liberal opinions to himself. And if you pressed him, he would say, well, I don't want to offend anybody. Only too often, Machen continued, that desire has come perilously near dishonesty. The teacher of religion is constrained to hide his radicalism because he knows it would cost him his position in the church. Now, I'm going to tell you a personal story, something that I remember from my childhood. I witnessed this conspiratorial and revolutionary spirit at work early in my own theological education. And in the late 1980s, I attended a prestigious Jesuit boys' high school in Los Angeles. And I remember on several occasions the theological faculty teaching us something that was contrary to official church teaching. And this was a Catholic school, remember? So we had Jesuit novitiates, Jesuit priests teaching theology, teaching Scripture. And it was, like everything about a Jesuit education, very thorough, very rigorous, and to a high standard. It was not the standard of the church, but it was to a high standard. So you learned your heresy. It was drilled into you. And I distinctly remember the priest saying, now don't go back and tell Sister Mary Sunshine what I just told you. Right? I know she taught you catechism. I know she said that the bread turns into the body of Christ. And I know she said that Jesus' body came out of the grave and ascended into heaven. But we know a better way of explaining that. We know a way of explaining that doesn't have to be so literal. But don't go back and tell Sister Mary Sunshine what I just said. I distinctly remember my freshman year scripture teacher telling us that if archaeologists found and somehow could positively identify the remains of Jesus buried in the Holy Land, that it would not challenge, quote, it would not challenge our faith one bit. And even then, at that point, I was very young in my faith. I was attending this Jesuit school, but at 14, I had gotten baptized in a Presbyterian church. So I was reading John Calvin, I was reading my Bible, I was reading the Reformers, and then I was going to this Jesuit school and getting a very liberal, modernist, Roman Catholic take on theology. But even I thought that was a bridge too far. Surely the whole thing hinges on whether Jesus arose from the dead, right? And if you could positively, I remember thinking, they found him in a morgue somewhere with a tag on his foot, that somehow wouldn't change our faith. Well, I'm quite sure, as I think about it in hindsight, that it wouldn't have changed her faith at all, because she was actually a UCC, I don't think she was ordained, but she was a member of the big UCC church in downtown Los Angeles. And again, this is a Catholic school, right? So she wasn't wrong insofar as she was describing the lack of effect it would have had on her own modern liberal faith. The chief modern rival of Christianity is liberalism, Machen wrote, adding at every point the two movements are in direct opposition. And I just want to underscore again, Machen's use of the word liberal here is not in a political sense, right? He's not talking about the Liberal Party over in England or in Canada that just won the election, nor is he talking about the Democratic Party. He's talking about a theological system. America's mainline Protestant churches succumbed to modernism and liberalism in the 1920s. The Roman Catholic Church held out for another generation, not until Vatican II in the 1960s and its aftermath in the 1970s would the Roman Church defect en masse and in the same way. And so by the time I was a student at a Catholic school in the 1980s, the revolution was in full swing. And I have just corroborated that Machen noticed this in the 1920s, that at the universities and seminaries, they didn't hide what they were. The same was true at my Jesuit high school. They did not hide from us that they were teaching something contrary to the official teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. The modernist liberals of Machen's day preferred to speak of experience rather than doctrine. They preferred to speak of an encounter with the person of Jesus rather than defend dogmatic definitions of who that person was. Creeds may come and go, the liberal argued, as they are merely, quote, merely the changing expression of a unitary Christian experience. At bottom is the shared Christian experience, which is bound to be the same. If the liberal can convince himself that he is having his own version of a genuine Christian experience, what does it matter if he cannot accept the virgin birth? After all, it's Christ he wants. It's Christ, he says, he experiences in the symphony and in the sunset. Why bother with a theological system to parse it all out and suck the life out of it? Now, the Bible study I've been running on Wednesdays for the last 2 weeks, we've been covering the Catechism, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. And on last Wednesday, someone asked me what the Catechism was, and I'll come back to that. But behind each catechism is something called systematic theology. And I think there's actually a couple of books of systematic theology up here. I have a 3-volume set of Charles Hodge's systematic theology, which is excellent. Excellent. The high watermark of American theology, Reformed writing in the 19th century. It hasn't been surpassed, in my opinion. But it's probably twice as long, if not 3 times as long as the Bible. Right? And it's not the Bible. So there is an argument to be made for these systems that tend to suck the life out of your faith and your experience, right? So I don't want to let that just pass by. There is a valid criticism, and I'm going to give you an illustration from the history of our own first church. In seeming to object to all theology, Machen wrote, the liberal preacher is often merely objecting to one system of theology in the interests of another. And that, I think, is important. If you want to come along and say, let's push all of these boring old dusty books aside, and let's just have the Bible, let's just have Jesus, as neutral as that might sound, as good as that might sound, there's usually another theological system behind it. And Machen is arguing that system is actually liberalism and modernism. So let me illustrate this with an anecdote from recent events in this church. As you know, 2 weeks ago, I began a Bible study based on the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Now, I've had two questions so far about this. The first is, what is a catechism? And the second isn't so much a question as a statement that implies a question. Quote, I thought catechisms were Catholic. The implied question there being, why are we doing this, right? So the answer I've given is that a catechism, in addition to being the forerunner of the frequently asked questions, or FAQ, that you can find on the product page of your favorite toothpaste, that a catechism is similar to, or just a systematic way of outlining the Christian faith as it is taught in the Bible. It's not uniquely Roman Catholic, because all of the churches of the Reformation adopted their own and wrote their own catechisms. So there's nothing uniquely Roman Catholic about it. You just may remember from childhood your Catholic friends getting on a bus and going to CCD, or being called out of class to go to their catechism class. But you had catechism too, probably, but you maybe didn't call it that. And we'll come to why that changed. What a catechism does is to ensure that a system of theology is made explicit. Now, remember, I said that anyone who tells you they just want Jesus or they just want the Bible is really chasing after something he can't have. There's always going to be a system somewhere. And so it's better to know what that system is rather than to let yourself be... sorry. Rather than to just let yourself be, blown and guided by forces that you don't recognize are there. So what a catechism does is to ensure that a system of theology is made explicit. The Baltimore Catechism taught the Roman Catholic system, and the Westminster taught the Reformed. And that's what we used here, and that's what we're using here. In reviving the study of the Westminster Catechism at First Congregational Church in Woodbury, I'm conscious of restoring visible theological continuity with the first 250 years of this congregation's history. We've been around a long time, right? And the historian in me, the history major in me, just loves it. I just soak it up every time I walk over here and just breathe it, literally inhale it sometimes from the dust gathering on some of the old moldy manuscripts and pages, right? Somebody asked me who the picture of the minister in the hallway there. I assume he's one of our ministers wearing the wig and everything. This is one of those places where the portraits of of these old ministers kind of follow you. If you're here by yourself one day, look at the portraits around in the hallway over there and see if you don't feel that there's somebody else with you. So there's 350 years of presence in this church. 250 years of it was as a Reformed church, right? So see if you can spot both the naturalism and the rejection of history that Machen says characterizes the modernist mind. In the superintendent's report from our Sunday school year, from our Sunday school here, for the years 1933 and 1934. So I'm reading you a report from our Sunday school superintendent almost 100 years ago, in 1933 and 34. She writes, she's giving a little report to the Sunday school of 1933 about what it was like when she went to Sunday school here at First Church Woodbury, probably a generation before. She writes, when we were very young, our Sunday school teacher was an austere spinster who taught by the aid of a long black ruler. Part of the teaching routine was the recital each Sunday of part of the shorter catechism. We used to wonder why it was called shorter, and also if there was a longer catechism. We hoped not. No effort was made to explain the meaning of the words. We just learned it. That kind of Sunday school teaching has taken its place with tallow dips and the covered wagon. The material of today is more practical. Lesson material is based more on nature. An interest in nature helps open the child's eyes to the higher things of life. Quote, and this is a quote within a quote, teach a child to love nature and you teach him to love God, end quote, says a well-known pioneer in child education. Now, that whole quote that I just read you comes from the parish history, the church history that was written in 2020 for our 350th anniversary. It was written by Sarah Griswold and Stephen McGrath. And it's I've passed it out to you for the new members class, and I still have copies of some in the basement if you would like, in my office if you would like one. It's a good history. Whatever defects in our Woodbury spinsters' reformed pedagogy there may have been, our parish historians understood the significance of this quote and commented on it in the very next paragraph. The dramatic shift in the Sunday school curriculum, they write, would be a significant one for the entire church. And remember, we're talking about our church here. No longer would the young people be brought up with a distinctive Reformed tradition theology that distinguished them from other denominations. So our church historians of First Church Woodbury, Sarah Griswold and Stephen McGrath, writing in 2020 about the superintendent's report from 1933, understood what a big change it was to move away from this Reformed Sunday school curriculum and into something else. Removing such distinctions was a necessary first step in advancing the cause of church union, so dear to the hearts of modernist liberals. And you remember one of the things I talked about in the first lecture was that Machen opposed all of these church union schemes. He opposed, he opposed taking all of America's Protestant denominations that had distinct theologies and distinct ethnic origin stories and merging them into a general American Protestant church. And one of the reasons he opposed it is because he valued the distinctions. Episcopalians down the street have a different catechism and a different outlook on the way the church is structured than Congregationalists up the street. And Presbyterians had a different view as well. There were a lot in common, but there were also distinctions. So if you're going to try to merge all of these churches into one, the first thing you have to do is teach a generation that there's no distinction between them. So moving away from the spinster with the ruler and the Westminster Catechism to teaching about nature or using nature as a pedagogy, we could discuss how pedagogy works, and I tend to think that the spinster's method is not the best one, but the abandonment of the Reformed Catechism, of the Westminster Catechism, really did change the course of this church. And that was a decision that was made 100 years ago. And we weren't the only church that did it. This happened, across the board for America's mainline Protestant churches. By 1934, the First Congregational Church of Woodbury's Sunday school curriculum consisted of lessons in, quote, obedience, honesty, truthfulness, fair play, and property rights. So Machen, I think, would have recognized this abandonment of the historic Christian faith taking place in our Sunday school between 1920 and 1934, and he would have called it for what it was. He would have called it the replacement of the Christian religion with general principles and truths for good and ethical living. I doubt Machen would have objected to honesty, truthfulness, fair play, and property rights, but he would have said that such things can only ever be enjoyed as the fruits of a lively Christian faith and the culture that it builds, not as a substitute for them. When you take an oath, you still see this when you take an oath to be sworn in to office. You put your hand on the Bible and you take an oath. And you usually end it by saying, "So help me God." Do you know why you put your hand on the Bible? Do you know what the symbolism of that is? What you're saying is that I acknowledge that there's a higher authority. And if I'm lying, I also acknowledge that I will be judged by that higher authority. So the idea of taking an oath and of putting your hand on the Bible is an acknowledgement that truth and virtue has to have its roots in a belief in the Almighty, in the belief in God. And once you start to strip that out from a people, truth becomes very relative. Truth, if you no longer believe that there is a power beyond the state power or the power beyond the police power of the state to punish you for breaking your oath, then why should you be good? Why will you be good? Why will an entire people who are taught and educated and reared that way, why would they be good? So I think Machen would say that, sure, for a Sunday school to teach honesty, truthfulness, fair play, and property rights, that's Christian culture running on fumes, right? We need to get the gasoline back into the engine. Quote, "The enemy has not really been changed into a friend," he writes, merely because he has been received within the camp. Very different is the Christian conception of a creed. According to the Christian conception, a creed is not a mere expression of Christian experience, but on the contrary, it is a setting forth of those facts upon which experience is based. In other words, the facts of Christian history must be explained, which means, therefore, creeds are necessary. Catechisms are required. Doctrine is essential. Why? Because they give an account of what happened in Christian history. Just as Peter gives an account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to Cornelius in Acts 10, Christians also need an account of what happened in the life of Christ and what it means for them. Machen writes, Christ died. That is history. And no one really argues that, right? The liberal doesn't come in here and say, well, some liberals, some modernists will question whether Jesus existed or not, but most don't do that. Most agree that Jesus was a historical person. So for any one person, even an atheist, to say Christ died is not a problem. Christ died, that is history, Machen wrote. Quote, Christ died for our sins, that is doctrine. Without these two elements joined in an absolutely indissoluble union, there is no Christianity. And I think this is really what the point he's trying to make. The modernist liberal tries to keep Christ, tries to keep his story, but tries to separate him from the doctrine. And what he's saying is, it's a meaningless life, or it's just a life like anyone else's at that point. But shouldn't it be possible to meet Jesus the person, Jesus the man, and to meet him not through the questions and answers of the shorter catechism, but through nature, as our Sunday school superintendent of nearly 100 years ago seems to have thought? And if it's possible to meet Jesus through nature, then surely isn't it possible to know him through all the major world religions, or at least the Abrahamic faiths? And how many of you have heard some version of that, right? And can't we, if for no other reason than because we want to be kind, can we not say that Jesus will reveal himself to all who seek him, even if they know not who or what they seek? I mean, these are questions I get asked all the time. Why do I have to be a Christian? Why do I have to come to church? Why do I have to believe what you're saying? And it's tempting. You want to say, oh, sure, you're right. You can just believe what you want. But Machen didn't think that was possible, and it's very clear as to the reason why, or at least he was very clear as to the reason why. The reason the answer must be no is because Jesus is the Christ, a fact of his own life of which he was quite aware. Christ, you recall, is the Greek word for Messiah, which simply means anointed, right? Machen calls this Jesus' messianic consciousness. And not only was he conscious of himself as the Messiah, the Christ, but he was very aware of why. The strange fact, Machen writes, is that this supreme revealer of eternal truth supposed that he was to be the chief actor in a world catastrophe and was to sit in judgment upon the whole earth. And this is true, right? When you read through the Gospels, especially, and you read Jesus' words, when you read what Jesus is saying about himself, he's saying this. He's saying, I'm going to sit in judgment. And not only that, you're going to sit with me in judgment of the tribes of Israel. In fact, we will judge angels together. So at this point, you've got to say, is this man talking nonsense? And many people have tried to separate this messianic vision and self-identity that Christ has of himself from other things that Christ says. Perhaps no other term sums up creedless Christianity better than the Golden Rule. The Sermon on the Mount has long been held by liberal Christians as the perfect distillation of Christ's teaching, a pure teaching, without any accretions of theology and doctrine to sully it, right? Just read the Sermon on the Mount. Just be kind to each other. Just do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And, if Bill were here, I think he would agree with me, because this is a discussion that I've often had with him. If you're dealing with a wicked person, do you really want them to treat you the way they want to be treated? The error, Machen writes, consists in supposing that the Golden Rule, with the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, is addressed to the whole world. As a matter of fact, the whole discourse is expressly addressed to Jesus' disciples. The persons to whom the Golden Rule is addressed, Machen continued, are persons in whom a great change has been wrought. Such persons will have pure desires. They and they only can safely do unto others as they would have others do unto them. For the things that they would have others do unto them are high and pure. And to illustrate that, he uses the example of a drunk, right? Every drunk would be more than happy for you to buy him a drink because he's more than happy to buy you a drink when he has money, right? So the idea of doing unto others as you would have them do unto you really only makes sense if you have a right sense of what is good. So many of us are doing horrible things to ourselves. We're putting poison into our body with the chemicals that we ingest. We're putting poison into our hearts with the things we see on television or the internet, right? We're poisoning ourselves. We don't know how to do good unto ourselves. So why would we think we are able to do good unto others, is Machen's point, unless we have the heart of Christ, unless our hearts have been regenerated. And that goes back to his whole idea. You can have the traditional language, but if you don't have the redemptive religion that goes with that traditional language, your heart will never be changed. For Machen, the Sermon on the Mount can never be reduced to a blueprint for ethical living, distilled, to be sure, to its purest possible form by an extraordinary Jewish man of the first century, but of equal appeal to all men. The Sermon on the Mount, rightly interpreted, Machen wrote, makes man a seeker after some divine means of salvation. And I've had this conversation with people over the years. Some of my friends, one in particular who's fairly astute about these things, once pointed out to me that, as hard as it was to be a good Jew in the first century, as hard as it was to keep the law of Moses, when you read the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus actually sets the bar higher, right? Moses says, the great example is the teaching on divorce. Moses says you can divorce your wife for really no reason whatsoever. And Jesus says, no, you can't divorce your wife because once you've been joined, you cannot be separated, right? And so Jesus is only drawing out the implication of what happened in the Garden of Eden. But Moses gave his people a loophole, and they still couldn't live up to it. Jesus has only raised the bar higher, right? So even the ethical teachings of the Sermon on the Mount serve ultimately to convict us of our sin and of our need for a Savior. Moses was too high for us, too hard even for the disciples, is Machen's point. Before this higher law of Jesus, he writes, who shall stand without being condemned? The Sermon on the Mount, like all the rest of the New Testament, really leads a man straight to the foot of the cross. Thus, Machen saw a split coming in the church, a division anticipated and to some extent already determined back when the Sermon on the Mount was first preached. Speaking with full messianic consciousness of the event, the judgment day of history, Jesus says in Matthew 25, verses 31 to 33, Jesus says, when the Son of Man shall come in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then shall he sit upon the throne of his glory, and before him shall be gathered all nations, and he shall separate them one from another, as a shepherd divideth his sheep from the goats, and he shall set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. Right? That's Jesus' messianic consciousness right there. And I've seen people try to parse the text and say, well, Jesus didn't really say that. There's a whole thing called the Jesus Seminar, where, again, you've got experts who go through the New Testament and try to come up with a reason for taking stuff out of the text and saying Jesus didn't really say that. I'd have to go back and check whether this makes it in. But I think even the Jesus Seminar, which is to say even these people who are coming at the text without an eye of faith, but thoroughly critical, with a thoroughly critical eye, even they, I think, admit that Jesus said these types of things. Now, people are inclined to say, well, he was clearly delusional, but he may have said them, right? But the one thing you can't do is say that Jesus didn't think of himself this way. That the only thing Jesus came to do was give us an ethical system that was even harder than the law of Moses. That's the one thing I think you really can't say. Machen allowed for tolerance and even a measure of fellowship among Reformed and non-Reformed Protestants. And you've got the Reformed Protestants coming out of the Calvinist tradition, which is Congregationalists and Presbyterians and some Episcopalians, and non-Reformed Protestants, which are the rest of the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Lutherans. So Machen said, we've got a lot in common. We're all children of the Protestant Reformation, so we've got a lot in common. We have differences. He didn't want the children of First Church Woodbury not to learn what made them different from the Methodists or different from the Episcopalians, but he understood that we had more in common than we didn't. And Machen, perhaps surprisingly for a Protestant of that day, and this is the 1920s, remember, he even had a generous attitude towards Roman Catholics. But he had no tolerance for the split between Christians and modernist liberals, especially when those modernist liberals insisted on calling themselves Christians. Machen writes, we would not indeed obscure the difference which divides us from Rome, he wrote, but Profound as it is, he continued, it seems almost trifling compared to the abyss which stands between us and many ministers of our own church. And remember, he's a member of the Presbyterian Church USA at this point. He's part of the Northern Church. The Southern Church had split off at the time of the Civil War. He's saying, I, as a Protestant, Reformed Christian, born and bred, have more in common with a Roman Catholic than I do with the modernist, liberal members of my own church. Why? Because the Roman Catholics still believed in the Trinity. They still believed in the atoning death of Jesus Christ. They still believed in the bodily resurrection and the bodily ascension. They still believed in the virgin birth. There was a lot that Machen would have criticized the Roman Catholic Church for, including its whole system of works righteousness and sacramental salvation. But he wouldn't have said that they weren't Christian, and he reserved that for the members of his own church who were denying all the things I just said, who denied the virgin birth, who denied the atonement, who denied sin, who denied the bodily resurrection and the ascension. This division is prior to and any other and insurmountable in Machen's mind, and to Machen it must be opposed. He writes, quote, "The Church of Rome may represent a perversion of the Christian religion, but naturalistic liberalism is not Christianity at all. Coming to this realization has led many otherwise loyal sons and daughters of mainline Protestant churches to abandon the church of their fathers and mothers, either becoming Roman Catholic or going to some non-denominational, evangelical, or fundamentalist church where the gospel is preached. The modernist liberal mind virus decimated America's mainline Protestant churches, depriving them in many cases of their founding stock and of the redemptive message that could have allowed them to replenish their membership. The result was a tragic wasting of political, social, cultural, and moral capital. And I think this is true, we are worse as a country for it. Going forward, Machen advised conservatives and liberals to avoid personal animosity. And he wrote that in 1923. And so I want to conclude by exploring the question of whether we can still do that in 2025. Machen wrote, "It does not involve any lack of sympathy on our part for those who have felt obliged by the current of the times to relinquish their confidence in the strange message of the cross." Right? It is a strange message. How does a Jewish man being nailed to a tree 2,000 years ago save my soul for all eternity? It is a strange message. So he's saying if your friends and family and neighbors have abandoned that message, you don't need to hate them, right? We don't have to have animosity. He then enumerates the many ties he thought Americans living just a little over 100 years ago still had in common. So he's looking at a country in 1923, and he says, this is what I think we still have in common. Many ties, he writes, of blood, of citizenship, of ethical aims, of humanitarian endeavor, unite us to those who have abandoned the gospel. So he still sees a common ground, right? He sees a common ground with fellow Christians, other Protestants and Roman Catholics in the faith. And he sees a common ground with people who have rejected the faith in blood, citizenship, ethical aims, and humanitarian endeavor. But I'm wondering now in 2025 if any of this still holds true, at least on a national scale. Blood ties, by which I think Machen must have meant race and ethnicity, are founded on extended networks of kin and religion and the identities formed thereby. However, this has all come under fire in recent generations, especially since the 1960s. By design, the federalism of the United States protected these regional ties of blood and ethnicity, of race and religion. Congress was even prevented by the First Amendment from interfering with the established churches of the various states which had them. Connecticut's Congregationalist establishment lasted until 1818, which means that Connecticut was protected from federal encroachment that would have tried to deprive this state of the Congregational Church, which was its official church at that time. You go up to Hartford now, and that fact is all but forgotten, right? Christopher Caldwell writes in his book, The Age of Entitlement, quote, "Americans have in recent years been fond of boasting that unlike most other nations, where it is heritage, history, and race that bind people together, the United States is a place that one can belong to regardless of background. That is true enough, but there is a reason most countries are not multi-ethnic countries, and why most of those that have been tried, a reason why most of those that have tried to become multi-ethnic countries have failed. Where a shared heritage is absent or unrecognized, as it is in the contemporary United States, all the eggs of national cohesion are placed in the basket of the Constitution. Hence a paradox. with the dawn of the civil rights era, the U.S. Constitution, the very thing that made it possible for an ethnically varied nation to live together, came under stress. The unwritten moral and ethical Constitution, that was the end of that quote. Now, this is me again. The unwritten moral and ethical Constitution of the United States is equally stressed in our day. And remember, Machen is saying, we're all the same people. We're tied together more or less by blood. And we're tied together by what we think is right and wrong. And we're tied together by what we think is good for our fellow man, right? He saw that as stuff we had in common 100 years ago. But ask yourself if that's true still to this day. The moral and ethical constitution of our country is stressed, right? Liberal and conservatives no longer share many ethical aims in common. One side, and I'm not making a comment on this one way or the other in this lecture, I think you know where I stand, but when one side thinks abortion is a fundamental right and the other that it's murder, there's an impasse, right? You can't reconcile those two. Indeed, Christians are inclined to see in our neighbor's ability to reconcile with us on this issue evidence that that our neighbor has done exactly what Machen accused him of abandoning the gospel, right? And you may say, well, if an atheist believes in abortion, that's one thing, but you've got Christians who think that too, right? So how do you bridge that? How do you bridge that gulf? That leaves, so we don't seem to have a common ethic anymore. Our ethnic heritage was always a melting pot, but we had methods of sort of dealing with that. And then we also kind of had a common, for lack of I think it's correct to say we had a common Christian ethic that we agreed on, but we don't have that anymore. So maybe we still have a humanitarian common ground. Maybe we can find helping others being something that you can unite us. If race and blood and ethics and religion and a sense of right and wrong, if none of that unites us, maybe at least humanitarian endeavors are the last thing we have in common. But again, I look out there and I'm not sure I don't see a lot to make me think that's true. Just look at the war in Ukraine, right? Look at Israel. I don't want to get into your opinions on that right now, but those two issues alone will divide a room very quickly, right? And it seems to sometimes go down party lines, but remember, people will say the war in Ukraine is about a humanitarian crisis, right? Or what's happening in Israel or Palestine is a humanitarian crisis, and people will go to knock down, drag out fights about that. Right? They'll shut down universities. They'll block the streets over that. So I'm not even sure we agree on what a humanitarian, effort looks like these days. So, all right, that's all on a national scale. What about closer to home? We could look at something like our own Red Barn, the thrift store, right? How many of these still exist? It's a handful of remaining local examples, right? Where neighbors come together to volunteer and to shop and raise money to support both the church and those in need. And that's great. And I think the Red Barn is off to a great start this season, and it's proving the point. Yes, here in our town, there is at least one thing that has where we have common ground in the Red Barn. But the problem with these outreach or service ministries is that many mainline Protestant churches have been reduced to being not much more than these ministries themselves, right? So the thrift store, the nursery school, the women's shelter, and the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting. I've seen this in many churches. They're getting more people to them than the church service is, right? The main reason that many people go to a church in a given town is because of the AA meeting, the nursery school, the women's shelter, the thrift store, or whatever else is going on there, not the Sunday morning service. And without the support of a strong congregation, these ministries also have a tendency to become the tail that wags the dog. In the first church I served in New York City, we operated a children's theater as an outreach ministry. We had 200 families in that children's theater, and maybe one or two of those families were actually involved in the church. 200 families in the children's theater, 25 people in church on Sunday, right? You add to that the difficulties of obtaining matching grants to support these ministries from corporations that won't donate to churches. You could solve that problem if you set up, say, the children's theater or the Red Barn as a separate 501c3. Then you can get matching grants. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, if you're the handful of faithful people still trying to operate your church, are we still a church, right? I mean, we've got a classic case of mission drift, a textbook case of mission drift going on in these churches where the outreach ministries have replaced the original purpose of the church. So I would say that even though we may still be able to find some common ground in certain humanitarian efforts, when the church is reduced to that, it's really lost its identity as a church. So I'll conclude by saying that this what I've just described is certainly a long way from the prayer of Deacon John Minor when he arrived in Woodbury with the pioneer column from Stratford in 1673, that the people of this town, not just the church, right, but the people of the town might be an upright and godly people to the latest generations. And so it's that topic, the topic of God and man, the calling to himself of a godly people, that we will turn to next week.